put up your hand if there is a spare seat on your right. It's quite a lot. That's at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's pretty close to 20. So I think there may well be people downstairs. So we can let in 20 more people. Can somebody convey that message? Downstairs. I got it, John. Okay, and while we're doing that, Dale Jamieson has an announcement about the Animal Studies program.
So my name is Dale Jamieson. I was the founding director of the Animal Studies Initiative, and Dave already welcomed you to the conference today, but I just want to welcome you on behalf of the NYU Animal Studies Initiative, which was established in 2010, and its mission statement is to contribute to the development of animal studies by supporting intellectually and empirically rigorous scholarship on animals and our relationships with them, to start new conversations about animals, how we understand and represent their diversity and complexity, and how to best protect them and raise awareness about their importance. And also to build bridges between academic fields and between academia and society in the study of animals and our reactions with them. And we do things like we partner with other units to have conferences like this. We sponsor research. We run an undergraduate minor. We have a range of events ranging from the natural sciences to the humanities. And beginning next fall, we also have a new master's degree program in animal studies. And if you have, thank you, if you have any interest in that, there is a guy somewhere over there named Jeff Sebo who you should talk to about it. There's also leaflets around. And also, if you email animal.studies@nyu.edu, who knows what you'll get for Christmas? So, without any further ado, I'm going to turn the proceedings over to Matthew Liao.
Pardon me? One more seat check. One more seat check. Can you raise your right hand if you have a seat next to you? Open. Okay. Maybe another 15. Is this mic on? Is this mic on? Yeah, okay. Okay, great. So in the last session, ethical issues started to crop up, and we couldn't have better speakers than the ones we are going to have now. In an introduction to the principles of morals and legislation, Jeremy Bentham famously wrote, the question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And I think we can all agree that our next three speakers have all really significantly contributed, not just academically, but also practically to reducing the suffering of animals around the world. So I'm very delighted to first introduce Professor Peter Singer. He's the Ira W. Decamp Professor of Bioethics at Princeton University. He's also an Australian. And he's particularly known for his influential book, Animal Liberation, which is widely considered by those in the animal liberation movement to be the founding philosophical statement of its ideas. And following Jeremy Bentham, Peter argued that the interests of animals should be considered because of their ability to experience suffering, and he's going to say more about that today. Peter?
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to relate the really fascinating morning and early afternoon that we've had to some of the ethical questions more directly. There's nothing new, of course, about the idea that consciousness marks an ethically important division. In fact, we could go back to the 3rd century AD, where the Neoplatonist Porphyry wrote, "To compare plants with animals is doing violence to the order of things. For the latter are naturally sensitive and adapted to feel pain, to be terrified and hurt, on which account they may be injured. But the former are entirely destitute of sensation, and in consequence of this, nothing foreign or evil or hurtful or injurious can befall them." And I thank Tyler Doggett for having reminded me of that quote recently. Now, we might want to modify that statement in some ways. We might say, as we've heard, that the term animals is too broad. It includes sponges even, and we certainly I guess, don't have evidence that sponges can feel pain or be sensation, capable of being terrified or hurt. So we do need to draw some distinctions. We need to discuss which animals we're talking about, and we're likely to end up, as we saw very clearly in the last session, with many uncertainties and different degrees of confidence about different kinds of animals. The view that I took in Animal Liberation on this both referred to the capacity, of course, that we're talking about, and then made a moral claim. And I just want to read a couple of sentences from that. If a being suffers, there can be no moral justification for refusing to take that suffering into consideration. No matter what the nature of the being, the principle of equality requires that its suffering be counted equally with the like suffering, insofar as rough comparisons can be made, of any other being. If a being is not capable of suffering or of experiencing enjoyment or happiness, there is nothing to be taken into account. So the limit of sentience, using the term as a convenient, if not strictly accurate, shorthand for the capacity to suffer and or experience enjoyment, is the only defensible boundary of concern for the interests of others. As that shows, I use terms like capable of suffering and or experiencing enjoyment or happiness, as well as the term sentience. I also wrote about animals feeling pain. The capacity to suffer and or experience enjoyment is what I regard as morally significant. We heard in the last session that Feinberg and Mallet say that all jawed vertebrates could have experienced sharp, fast pain, but that's different from suffering. Well, I think there's, maybe we can discuss how we're going to use the term suffering, if that's the important one. I would want to use it, I think, in a broader way, that suffering does not require self-awareness or self-reflection, but that simply the fact of feeling the pain could be enough to say that inflicts suffering on a being, even if it's not something that is part of a continuously connected self, perhaps. It still inflicts suffering at that moment. Is this the same as Stephen Harnad's idea of is there ouch there? Well, yes, perhaps that's the same thing that we're talking about. Well, then what about the ethical significance of this capacity? Let me quote you from Henry Sidgwick, who those of you who are not philosophers will not have heard of. He's the least well-known of the three great 19th century utilitarians. You've heard of Jeremy Bentham, just quoted by Matthew Liao. You've heard of John Stuart Mill. Henry Sidgwick is the best philosopher of the three, but the least widely read. Yes, Dale, I know your fondness for Mill there. Okay, so Sidgwick takes it as self-evident. He talks about whether there's self-evident truths in ethics, and he thinks that there are some, that the good of any one individual is of no more importance from the point of view, if I may say so, of the universe, than the good of any other, unless, that is, there are special grounds for believing that more good is likely to be realized in the one case than in the other. So I think even in that little passage you can see why Sidgwick is such a good philosopher, because he says on the one hand the bold statement, the good of any one individual is of the same importance of any other, a great proclamation of kind of equality. Notice no lines drawn about species. This is not just about humans, any one individual. But then he says, qualifies that immediately, unless, that is, there are special grounds for believing that more good is likely to be realized in the one case than in the other. And that surely is part of what we're talking about right now. Is there more good to be realized, or for that matter, more bad to be realized in the experiences of a human than there is of a fish? And which fish, of course, we have to talk about as well. So that, I think, is an important part of it. And Sidgwick also thought that ultimate good comes down to some form of consciousness, to desirable consciousness. That there's no good outside, no intrinsic value outside consciousness. Others, like my teacher at Oxford, R.M. Hare, gets something like the same result by maintaining that to make an ethical judgment, we must put ourselves in the position of all of those affected by that judgment, take on their experiences, whatever they may be. And Hare too, like Sidgwick, did not simply say that this is to be limited to humans. So we have to take them on with their subjective experiences, obviously. But if you try to put yourself in the position of something that has no subjective experiences, if we assume that might be the case with a cabbage or with a sponge, then there's nothing to be taken into account because there's nothing that it's like to be that being. Now, that view that there's nothing more to be taken into account has been challenged. Tom Regan, who was a great advocate for animal rights, did once argue that even an inanimate object like a car can have an interest, for example, in having antifreeze added to its radiator in winter, because that's good for it. Holmes Ralston, as an environmental ethicist, doesn't go that far, but he does think that although plants may have no consciousness and no will or desires, they have a good of their kind that can provide a reason for valuing them, and that other non-conscious entities like species or ecosystems can also have a good. I disagree with both Regan as far as the car aspect is concerned and with Ralston, but I'm not going to go into that argument here. Even if you think they could be right, it'll be enough, I think, for my purposes, if you share the idea that one thing that we can be sure of is that conscious states are important, that it matters whether beings have positive or negative conscious states, enjoy their lives or suffer and miserable. And whether there are some other things that matter as well is something that we can leave for further debate and discussion. Now, the other question is then what moral principle we hold about these other beings. The moral principle I defended in Animal Liberation and continue to defend is the principle of equal consideration of interests, which in fact is just what Sidgwick was talking about, where he said good counts the same if it's similar kind of good. So equal consideration of interests, so if something causes as much pain to a non-human animal as it causes to a human, then that's just as bad in both cases. The fact that we are also human doesn't mean we are justified in giving more weight to the interests of the human. But of course we do have to say, well, what does cause as much pain? And as was made clear in the last session, you can't assume that pains are the same or similar, so you have difficult questions of judgment in trying to apply equal consideration of interests. I think it's helpful to distinguish two questions that certainly raised by the things we've talked about. One of them is perhaps what we've been most focusing on. How do we know whether certain beings are conscious beings, where they can feel pain, whether they can suffer, whichever of these terms we wish to use? How can we know which of them do? And what should we do when we're uncertain of the answer to that question? And a second question that we haven't really tackled very much, perhaps because it seems so difficult, is suppose we grant that some beings are conscious beings. Let's just say chickens, for example. How should we compare their well-being with that of a normal human, or for that matter, with other non-human animals? Let's say pigs. Okay, so I'll just say a little bit about both of those questions. In Animal Liberation, I wrote, quote, "Somewhere between a shrimp and an oyster seems as good a place to draw the line as any and better than most." I think it turns out that this wasn't a bad hunch. David Cassio discussed the nervous system of bivalves in a blog called The Animalist earlier this year, and after going through a lot of the scientific evidence, concluded bivalves have no central nervous system. They cannot use endogenous opiates or opiate receptors to inhibit pain, as they have no brain or way to process sensory input, and he concluded that it's very probable that they are not capable of feeling pain. So bivalves, of course, means things like oysters, mussels, clams, and so on. maybe someone in the audience will tell me that that's wrong, or that we shouldn't lump them all together, that they have different capacities. I'll be interested to hear that and learn that if that is the case. But if that's so, then I'm right in saying that this doesn't extend to all of the non-human animals, and even doesn't extend to some that people occasionally eat. So that's another issue. Maybe some animals that one is justified in eating, at least as far as their pain is concerned, or lack of pain. On the other side of the line, above that, more like the shrimp, of course, we've had more relevant discussions today, particularly from Andrew Barron, and in the article that he wrote with Colin Klein about insect nervous systems, he argued that the insect nervous system, the idea that the insect nervous system is a decentralized one, is no longer really accurate, that instead insects have an enlarged cephalic ganglion. They equate this to a brain and assert, as we also heard this morning, that insects have a capacity for subjective experience. Now that is perhaps a somewhat speculative conclusion, as we've discussed at this stage in our knowledge, and I think that that's been acknowledged, but it at least certainly raises that as a possibility that we need to consider. And of course, we've also heard there's many different kinds of insects. Some have more neurons than others. Honeybees, we were told, have around 1 million, which may be not very many compared to our 20 billion or so, but still enough to be capable of performing and interpreting the famous waggle dance and perform a whole lot of other characteristics. So if that's true of insects, then Barron and Klein also suggest it's maybe true of crustacea and perhaps of spiders as well, but not true of plants, not true of animals like the jellyfish. We heard about the box jellyfish today, or nematodes, which don't have any structures that allow for awareness. If then insects, spiders and crustaceans have subjective experiences, if I say they do, there's much more consciousness in the world than we may have thought, because there are, according to the Smithsonian Institution's estimate, some 10 quintillion individual insects alive at any one time. That's an awful lot of consciousness. How we're to think about that, of course, depends on what we believe their subjective experiences could be like, and here the comparative structures may not tell us nearly enough. Another issue is the question that I think Eva Jablonka mentioned in her talk. She called it temporal thickness, and Peter Godfrey Smith also referred to temporality when he said that wasps lead short lives. But another thing that we don't know is what is the subjective experience of these short lives if they have them? I think Eva also mentioned William James' famous book, The Principles of Psychology, and James there quotes Herbert Spencer as saying, "A gnat's wings make 10 or 15,000 strokes a second. Each stroke implies a separate nervous action. Each such nervous action or change in a nervous centre is probably as appreciable by the gnat as is a quick movement of his arm by a man." Now, I'm not quite sure what the basis for that claim that it's as appreciable by the gnat is. But if that were so, then of course James goes on to say, or the quote from Spencer runs, then the time occupied by a given external change must seem much longer than in the other case when it's measured by one movement. Oh, okay. Steve Barney, who sent me this quote from James recently, points out that this would have significant animal welfare implications if it's true. If an animal's perception of time is much more refined or resolute than ours, then a given objective period of a certain amount of pain and suffering would be subjectively much worse for the animal than it is for us. So it's just another uncertainty. I don't know how we can really know that. So I think in the case of all of these uncertainties, we should give animals the benefit of the doubt when we can. That relates to questions of what are the benefits for us in doing something that might cause them pain or suffering, and what are the costs for them. So if it comes to things that we might eat because we enjoy the taste of their flesh, when we have healthy, nutritionally adequate available options, and we'd be causing them significant suffering, I think it's clear that even if we do have doubts, as perhaps some of you might have about fish after the last session, or about some fish, I think it's still clear that we ought to be giving them the benefit of the doubt, especially as there is no humane slaughter for fish in commercial practice. When we're talking about fish farming, which is an increasingly large area of fish production, there is some evidence that fish are depressed in those very crowded, confined conditions of fish farming. But other questions, it might be much harder to give them the benefit of the doubt. And that's why I asked Andy Barron about ants, right? As I was saying, if you live in Australia, at some stage in the warm weather, ants are going to invade your house in large numbers. And you then have to think what you're going to do about that. It's a harder problem, I think, than some of the dietary questions that we have. Okay, let me say a little bit briefly, I know my time's running out, about the second question. Can we compare the experiences of members of different species? And this is particularly relevant because of the rise of the effective altruism movement, which asks questions about how can we do the most good with our resources. Let's say those resources are money we can donate to an effective charity. We might give it to the Against Malaria Foundation, which will provide bed nets in malaria-prone regions, which will save lives of children. Or we might give it to the Humane League or Mercy for Animals, one of the effective animal groups that is going to use it to work to reduce the number of animals people will buy from factory farms, or perhaps get improvements in their conditions and save very large numbers of animals from a great deal of suffering. But how do we compare the sufferings of chickens with those of children getting malaria, or even, whether to focus on chickens, much larger numbers than pigs, say, but how does their suffering compare? It's a really difficult question. People have tried to talk about number of neurons in the brain and encephalization quotients and so on. I don't think that they're particularly useful measures, but maybe in the absence of any other measures, they may tell us something. I supervised an undergraduate thesis last year by a philosophy student called Kevin Wong, which was on trying to look at commensurability here. Wong's idea was that we could disaggregate some of the questions by talking about to what extent is, let's say, life in a factory farm a bad life for a chicken, as compared with whatever a good life with a chicken would be. That's one question. And then we could ask, and what would the ratio of chicken suffering to human suffering have to be to make the decision that we should work on reducing human suffering rather than reduce the suffering of that very large number of chickens? And then we can look at what evidence we might have to suggest what value we do get for our donations in these different areas, how many animals we could save from going through a lot of suffering for the sake of saving one human. And then we could say, well, and is that ratio reasonable or not? Is it reasonable? Let's say it's 1 to 100. We could save 100 chickens for the cost of saving one human, something like that. Is that a reasonable ratio? What if it were 1 in 1,000? What if it were 1 in 1,000,000? I don't think we have any real answers to those questions, but at least framing the questions in that way, I think may help us to see what is at stake and clarify our thinking about what it is that we're trying to answer. Thank you very much.
Great. So I forgot to mention that the way we're going to hold this session is that we're going to have all the speakers speak first, and then we're going to do the Q&A afterwards once they've all spoken. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention is that after the session, there's going to be a performance, a reception across the park at 40 Washington Square South at Vanderbilt Hall. So follow people to go there for the reception. Dave will say that again. So, And now we're delighted to have Professor Marian Dawkins. She's professor of animal behavior from Oxford University. She's written extensively on animal behavior and issues of animal welfare way back from the 80s. And her view is that, so unlike Peter's view, she's going to argue that consciousness is, promoting animals' welfare does not require that they be conscious. Let's welcome Professor Dawkins.
I see there are still spare seats here, so can you put up your hand one more time if you got a spare seat on your right? Let's say. Okay, so there's still a good 10 seats or so.
Thank you. Peter has very clearly enunciated why consciousness is important for animal welfare. But I have to say, it also highlights for me one of the big problems that I have in relating issues about animal consciousness to animal welfare science. Basically, because, as you said, animal welfare matters to people because they believe animals are conscious. Consciousness is not amenable to the normal methods of scientific investigation. Therefore, we cannot investigate animal welfare in the normal methods of science, so there can't be a science of animal welfare, and I've been worried about whether there was any way out of this dilemma. And basically, I'm going to outline 4 approaches that people take and discuss each of them. The first one is that there is no problem. And I cite Morel because this is not something she concludes at the end of her book. It's something she asserts, page 1, paragraph 1, line 1 of her book. And on the face of it, this would seem to be the most animal-friendly approach. You include as many animals as possible. But I think it does have problems of its own. If you just say you just know, and it's not worth even investigating even further, I think you could land yourself into some quite difficult dilemmas about how to treat, for example, robots that are interacting with people, doing many of the things we've heard invertebrates can do, and so on. And that actually, in the long run, that may rebound badly on animals because people can just say, oh, they're just robots. And so I think that's a slightly dangerous view to take. The second view is one that actually there is a problem, but we've solved it. This is particularly due to Mark Beckhoff, who says, just the sheer weight of the number of studies means that actually there isn't a problem anymore. We've kind of solved the hard problem in that kind of way. I only put this up because he calls my views Dawkins' dangerous idea. And for once, this doesn't mean Richard. And I should say, I didn't say that animals are not sentient. The dangerous idea is simply that we don't understand consciousness in ourselves. We know even less about it in other species. And frankly, I think pretending that consciousness is not a problem, making out we've solved the hard problem, actually, I think, again, is not good for animals. It makes people feel that those of us who work on animal welfare don't really understand the problem. They don't need to be taken seriously. And I think, actually, in the long run, animal interests are best served by being open and honest with what we know and what we don't know. I have to keep saying that, otherwise I get into problems. I want to discuss a particularly difficult version of this view, which I find very difficult, and I can only call it flirting with consciousness. And what I mean by flirting with consciousness is that you use a word in English that is consciousness-laden, like emotion or pessimism. And you know perfectly well that a lot of people are going to take it in its consciousness form. And then this may be quite good because you engage a lot of people, it may be quite good at getting grants, but it actually is quite ambiguous. The reason I call it flirting is that if somebody then challenges you, you say, oh, of course it's terribly difficult. So you lead people on, and then when they get serious, you say, no, that's not what I mean at all. And I find this a particularly difficult thing to deal with, and not everybody is as honest as Joe Ledoux. Joe Ledoux wrote a most great paper in which he severely criticised himself for doing exactly this. I think he's going to talk about this tomorrow. And he basically says, if you use these words in ways you know are going to be taken ambiguously, you're actually blurring important distinctions, you're confusing yourself. And again, I did not say... So what I'm basically saying is that claiming to have solved or flirting with the hard problem actually may look as though you're helping animals in the long run because you're giving them benefit of the doubt. But actually, I think if you're talking to people who are not already convinced, the unconvinced, it makes you think that you haven't understood the problem, that your welfare claims have no scientific basis, which means that they're going to take animal welfare less seriously, which is not helping animals. So the third solution is that, well, there is a problem. We haven't solved it yet, but we soon will. And obviously people are thinking that with brain imaging, we will maybe, the kind of what has been rudely called blobs on the brain kind of technology we have at the moment will give way to better ways of understanding the brain and more detailed ways of understanding it. That's perfectly possible. But the point I want to make is we want a science of animal welfare now. I don't want to be in a position of saying we can't have a science of animal welfare till we've solved the hard problem. That's the one situation I want to make sure we don't get ourselves into. So the fourth solution is that the problem exists, the hard problem exists, but it doesn't matter because we can actually have and should have a perfectly respectable science of animal welfare which doesn't involve consciousness. And we can say it remains the hard problem, the big problem in biology, to which we do not as yet have a solution. Doesn't say we won't or anything like that. A scientific approach to animal welfare is needed now, and therefore we need a science of animal welfare that is not based on first having solved the biggest problem in biology, and one that does not depend for its justification, for its basis on consciousness. And this one basically is talking, the first three positions are animal welfare with consciousness. This is one is animal without consciousness. So it needs a definition of welfare that doesn't exclude consciousness, but doesn't depend on it, and a definition that actually can bring most people in, whether on whatever their views are on consciousness are. We need empirical evidence of what actually does and does not improve welfare in practice. And frankly, we need, I think, a lot of positive steps. I think it's a hugely important research area, bringing together animal welfare with a whole lot of other things that people can buy into. So defining welfare without consciousness, a very simple definition is that the animal has what it needs to keep it alive, food, water, shelter, and it has what it wants. And everybody can agree animal health is important, and actually what animals want, I can go into this later, is also hugely important from giving their point of view. So this definition does not deny consciousness. It simply says, it doesn't say it actually depends on it. For example, we now have lots of ways of asking animals what they want. We can ask dairy cows whether they want to eat outside or whether they mind being inside by offering them a choice. We can ask rats what they think about being kept in isolation and whether they actually want to be close to other rats. In this case, this is an experiment which the rat had to push a lever lots of times to get different things and preferred rats to any other rats to anything else. We can ask gerbils whether they want to do big tunnels. We've now got a range of different ways in which we can ask animals what they want. We can take the animal's point of view. And indeed, if you look around the world at the way in which animal welfare science has developed, one of the most famous ways of measuring welfare is so-called 5 freedoms. And basically, they're 3 needs for health, food, water, and so on, and 4 wants. The animal is free to express its natural behaviour, and it's free from fear and stress, what it gets away from. So it's not a kind of unusual definition of welfare to define it without consciousness. And good animal welfare ticks many, many boxes. Lower mortality, lower levels of blemishes, lower disease levels, lower risk of human infection, less medication. It carries across cultures. It doesn't mean you have to suddenly try and convince somebody of a different culture that your values are better than theirs or anything else. And it is much more likely to be adopted by farmers if actually you can tie it into these other goods as well. So animal welfare without consciousness, it seems to me, is both possible and necessary. It does not need to have solved the problem, which is the hardest of all in biology, but it shouldn't pretend to have done so. But at the same time, it's open to any new information that may bear on that. It can investigate welfare objectively by looking at what actually does improve animal health, what the animals actually in practice want. And it can convince people who are not already convinced that animal welfare is a very good thing, because by linking it to the other things that we have in common, which an even wider range of people will agree to. So I would argue that animal welfare science, not based on consciousness, but open to any future gains, actually provides one of the best, i.e. most likely to succeed in winning over other people, basis for the ethical treatment of animals. Thank you very much. I hope I'm in time.
Okay, our last speaker is Professor Laurie Gruen. She's the William Griffin Professor of Philosophy at Wesleyan University. She's the author of several books, including Ethics in Animals and Entangled Empathy, an alternative ethics for our relationships with animals. Please help me welcome Professor Gruen. Do you need help?
I'm going to try to get set up. Let's see if this will work. I think Colin left. Well, thanks for staying around. It's been a long day. No, where's Colin? Oh dear, where did Colin go? Bad timing. Could you find him? Could you just find Colin? You've got Colin Allen. Colin Allen. I need Colin. Colin, what's your password? Colin. Shoot. Well, I'll just start, and we'll get my slides up. So I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with questions about animal consciousness. I'm glad to be here, and I'm very glad to be on this particular panel talking about animal ethics. My view that I've been developing called entangled empathy, that's okay, so it requires actually that we know who has and experiences a point of view, so who has subjective experience. That's the love part. So in order to sort of engage in what I think of as sort of ethical relations, we have to understand great. Nope. Let's go to the beginning. How do we go to the beginning? Right. Now we're at the beginning. So I have this love-hate relationship. Part of it is because from the point of view of my view of entangled empathy, we have to know and try to understand as best we can what it is that this subjective experiences of other animals might be. The downside of the relationship, or the downside of my attitude about animal consciousness, is that in order to know, we have to sometimes do things that I think of as generating a relationship that is really deeply and profoundly unethical. And so part of what I'd like to do today is to just talk a little bit about and raise a few cautions about some of the concerns that I have about the ways that we come to understand these other animals, so that we can, in fact, be in more ethical relationships with them. And I'd like to do this by way of identifying some pretty extreme views as a way to see sort of where the edges are. I think we saw a little bit about that during our fish discussion, which I thought was really wonderful to see the sort of range of views that exist. But let's start with the declaration that David mentioned at the beginning, which was the Declaration on Consciousness that basically determined that non-human animals, including all mammals and birds, and many other creatures, including the octopuses, also possess the neurological substrates necessary for consciousness. Now, this is a really controversial declaration. On the one hand, we have Mark Bekoff, for example, who was just mentioned, suggesting that this really had to be a joke. And indeed, he wrote, "This is crazy that this is something that has to be declared." Indeed, he says, "It was appeals to these very data that led to the conclusion of the group of scientists." So the idea is that there's been so much work that's been going on. Why on earth do we need a group to determine whether or not animals are conscious? This gets back to what Marian was saying about the problem solved. On the other hand, we have P.Z. Myers, for example, who says that they've reached this agreement. Okay, so good, it's good as it goes, but really, it's not clear exactly how we're going to go about measuring consciousness. So we have this statement, but we don't know how to measure consciousness. And what I'm really interested in thinking about in the brief time that we have is how are the processes of measuring consciousness, when we grant consciousness to other animals, going to in some ways implicate us in potentially dangerous, unethical relations. Now, many animal advocates, and we heard this a little bit today too from Victoria, basically say that we have all of these different kinds of cognitive, higher order cognitive sort of experiments that we've done. We see that other animals engage in visual cognition, they engage in problem solving. There's delayed gratification experiments that have been done, a whole variety of numerical tasks, spatial memory tasks, social and emotional learning. We've heard a lot about that also, basic instrumental learning. And all of these are done, and I liked this sort of arrangement of pictures. The bee picture is actually a drawing, it's not a picture. But because all of these environments are, as you can see, really human-infused environments. These aren't necessarily natural environments. But one of the things that these experiments, and there's many others like them, suggest is that given that these animals are able to solve all of these really complicated tasks, that we can infer consciousness based on these particular tasks that they're able to engage in. However, on the other hand, we do have what I call skeptics or human exceptionalists that suggest that this indirect inference method is not proof, that there's no conclusive scientific evidence showing that any non-human animals are conscious, and that existing measures aren't proof either way. I think Marian was just saying that, about animal consciousness. And in this regard, I'm going to the other extreme now and citing Dario Ringa, who is someone who advocates for all sorts of engagement with other animals and thinking of them as if they're not conscious. So what he says is, the truth is that we have no idea what a conscious state is. We do not know what neural substrates generate consciousness. We do not know how to recognize what is intentional behavior and what is not. We do not know if consciousness is a property that arises only in biological systems, nor do we know if consciousness is a binary or graded property. These are all open questions. Any assertion that non-human animals are capable of exhibiting conscious states as those experienced by humans is at best a working hypothesis based on vague concepts that need to be clarified. And interestingly and importantly, I think that one of the things about this clarification is that even if there's a clarification that's made, and we heard a number of clarifications earlier today, that's not going to satisfy this extremely skeptical position. So this brings up, from my point of view, three important concerns. The first concern, and this is something that we haven't really talked about, and it's uncomfortable to talk about, but I'm just going to raise it because this is a session on ethics, and that's that invasive methods are used to identify, measure, and compare neuroanatomical, neurochemical, and neurophysiological substrates. And these kinds of experiments are happening even for those who tend to be sympathetic to establishing that animals are going to suffer, right? So I'm not suggesting that there is some particularly problematic or pernicious group of people, although they may be. But I'm not suggesting that it's only those kinds of people who are going to be able to make the kinds of research advances that are going to lead to maybe some solution to the problem of consciousness. Because even those who are sympathetic and have particularly good reasons for trying to establish whether or not fish are able to feel pain still are engaging in a kind of experiment that causes fish pain. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. And here's an example that I think is quite remarkable and something that is sort of needs to be highlighted. So in Peter Godfrey Smith's really wonderful book, when I was reading it several months ago, I was struck by his discussion of tactile visual substitution systems, essentially a perceptual technology for blind people. And I was reminded when I was reading this very, very innocent. I mean, there was nothing that would be suggestive of anything untoward towards animals happening. I was reminded of a campaign that I actually was involved with over 30 years ago that involved developing this kind of technology in macaques in an extraordinarily cruel experiment. Some of you may know of it. It was the Britches experiment. So this experiment that led to infant stump-tailed macaque having his eyes sewn shut and a contraption placed on his head, separated from his mother, in with a surrogate monkey, this was the precursor to this fairly innocuous-seeming TVSS technology that PGS talks about when he's talking about sensory modes and perceptual modes in the context of thinking about what consciousness there might be. So again, I just am highlighting here that there are ways that there are experiments that have been done that we might look at and think, wow, I didn't realize that was what it was going to take to try to establish the evidence needed. Let me, so there's more explicit kinds of examples we've heard already: rewiring nervous systems, ablation of parts of the brain and visual system, and also isolation and deprivation of various sorts. A second caution that I want to raise, and that has to do with what I was alluding to a moment ago, is that many of the psychological experiments with other animals already presuppose conscious states. So there's been a tremendous amount of work over a vast number of years that already suggests that there are conscious states operating in animals. Stress research, I think, is one of the most obvious of these particular kinds of experiments. Earlier, Colin had suggested that perhaps dogs aren't being used in electric shock chambers, but I should just mention that at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where Harry Harlow was doing that early infant deprivation work with monkeys, there's deprivation work, maternal deprivation work, and primarily stress research that's being done. Initially, the work was being done separating infants from their mothers and isolating them for the first 4 weeks, and then raising them with peer isolates for another 4 weeks. They actually discovered that it was better to raise them with their mothers to increase stress, and that has everything to do with the housing of the animals at the facility, as opposed to the separation of being with their mother or not being with their mother. Empathy research is actually something I've done a lot of reading on. There's a lot of work with rats and voles in which these animals are, in some ways, forced to be in extreme situations, for example, put in water and forced to swim in order to figure out whether or not they're empathetic. Same thing with voles. There's a little bit of an electric shock happening, and then the vole is seen to engage in a kind of consoling behavior after the shock treatment, and that's led to various views about their rich emotional lives. But in order to make those claims about rich emotional lives, we have to already see that they're being used in ways that to some degree, undermine their well-being. And of course, pain research, as we've already talked a little bit about, pain research, I think, is one of those areas where you have to cause pain in order to determine whether or not an animal is capable of feeling pain. And so there is, and in order to, we already are to some extent assuming that there's some sort of pain processes to figure out whether or not another being can feel pain. My third concern is that, and this may, I think it would be really interesting to discuss this with Marian further, is that our consciousness, that is to say, our experiential point of view, may not be anything like that, it's come up already today, of other animals, particularly with completely different Umwelten, right? So their worldviews are just very, very different. Fish or some of the bees that we talked about earlier. So whatever measures it is that we design are prone to what I would suggest are anthropocentric or mammalian-centric bias. And given that, it strikes me that we need to ask questions about whether or not this kind of work is ultimately going to be justified. And my takeaway is that we need to really question not whether or not another animal is conscious, but what and whether we should do in light of the fact that many, many other animals are experiencing the world. Okay, thanks. I will sit down.
I'd like to invite the speakers to come up to the podium. Okay, so maybe I can kick off by asking the speakers a burning question that I have. So just as sort of about 100 years ago, we think that animals are less complicated than we do now. I feel that we're sort of moving towards we're 100 years from now, we're going to realize that the animals are even more sophisticated than we think that they are now. Okay, so but that puts me in a quandary. So I'm inclined to be very liberal about sort of animal consciousness, about whether they can be sentient or whether they can suffer. I feel like they can do all those things. They can have language as well. But that means that we have to confront the question of things like, so anybody who lives in New York knows that you're confronted from time to time with cockroaches, right? And so what do you do with these cockroaches? You know, if it turns out that they're sentient and they can suffer, et cetera, et cetera. And you know, Peter talked about the ants example in Australia. So I wonder whether we should think about turning the Bentham dictum in reverse, right? So it's true that suffering matters, but maybe another perspective is something like, well, maybe we should also think about whether they can reason, right? And if you go to YouTube, you'll see a lot of videos of animals helping each other. So Francis Duvall's work on sort of animal altruism, you got all these sort of proto-moral behaviors of the dog trying to take a different animal across the road, or you know, the gorilla taking care of the goose or something like that. And so it seems like if we go that route, there are a lot of animals, and I think we're going to discover that a lot more animals are more like have moral, like are able to act morally, like more morally than we think they can do now. So I just wonder whether, like, you know, I'd be interested in what the, you know, sort of, because I feel like if we go the other way, we're going to find that even ants can suffer. So maybe, yeah. So just as a question for the panelists, what do you think of, do you worry about sort of the reductio, and then what about this alternative way of thinking, maybe drawing different lines at the level where animals can reason? Thanks.
Well, I agree with Bentham on this, that I don't think whether they can reason is the question. I think whether they can suffer still is the question. Whether a being can reason is not in itself relevant to whether it's right or wrong to inflict suffering on that being. And of course, that criterion was used, and Bentham was reacting to it being used to say that only humans matter, as Kant, for example, essentially said, because the rest of us, only humans can reason, so only humans are ends in themselves, only humans are self-conscious, the others are merely means to an end. So I think Bentham was rightly rejecting that and saying we need to expand. I can't see why we should reduce if you're saying, well, there might be some beings that we can work out that they can reason, but we can't work out whether they can suffer. It depends what, we're going to get into these debates, just as we had a debate about, well, what does it really mean to say they can feel pain or they can suffer? We're going to get into a debate about what does it mean to say that they can reason. And if it's simply the kind of automatic processing that AI can already do, and I'm not precluding the idea that AI will eventually become conscious, but I don't think it is now, then the fact that cockroaches can reason as well as AI isn't going to show that it would be wrong to poison them. Whereas if they can suffer and the poison causes them to suffer, then that does show that at least you ought to try to find an alternative solution.
I'm afraid I completely agree with Peter.
No, that's all right. Don't be afraid.
That's good.
I'm afraid. You don't need to be particularly clever to suffer from hunger or pain. And I've always found it a bit odd that people search for consciousness in clever things that animals can do, rather than actually the more basic question of suffering.
So let me just clarify. I wasn't claiming that animals couldn't suffer or that would be hard. I was granting that we're going to get to a period where we're going to realize that all the animals can suffer, and I'm happy to grant that. But once we learn that all animals can suffer, seems like we need a more either we bite the bullet that we shouldn't be killing cockroaches, or we need some other distinction. And then the thought is something like, well, maybe whether they can reason morally, not just reason instrumentally, but reason morally. And the response to the Kantian idea is to say, well, look, that Kant was wrong about that only humans can reason morally. It turns out that, I'm prepared to believe that chimpanzees can reason morally, dolphins can reason morally, maybe octopus as well. So that was the idea.
Well, I was just going to add that I think that I have a lot of students that don't reason or reason morally. I don't know what we should do from that point of view.
You're on video.
Oops, no, none of the students recently. I did have a question though that I'm really interested in, because this question about animal welfare science, you're saying it doesn't presuppose consciousness, but there's all these mental states that you're attributing to animals. So I'm wondering what your thinking, desire and want and need amounts to in those instances.
The way I define them, they can be defined purely behaviourally if you want to. But I leave the question open of whether if an animal chooses something and shows that it wants it by working hard for it, whether it experiences or not.
So you're saying it wants it if it moves in one direction as opposed to another direction?
Well, there are lots of different ways we can measure that, but yes.
So if I could just follow that up. So could there be wanting without positive experiences, without positively valenced consciousness? There was this famous experiment by Olds and Milner some years ago in which they hooked up electrodes to the brains of rats, to their pleasure centers, as it was described, and then the rats would press an electrode to stimulate that part of their brain without eating until they dropped dead. That was the report anyway. But as I understand it, these experiments are now understood in a different way. Not that the rats were actually getting so much pleasure from the stimulation that they preferred it to eating, but rather that it was bypassing that pleasure aspect, and it was simply that they had become addicted or triggered to reinforcing that stimulus. So isn't it possible that when you set up your experiments where animals have to work to do certain things, they're not actually showing you that they enjoy those things when they get there, but that in some way they've become addicted to doing what it is or whatever? In other words, that they're not leading you to the state that the common sense of animal welfare would say that's a gain for their welfare?
I think that when we look at animals in unnatural situations, all sorts of odd things happen. I mean, we want things that are not particularly good for us. We want to eat food that are not particularly good for us. So in domesticated situations or unnatural situations, needs and wants become uncoupled. And I think it's important to look at that the wants evolved in nature as it were, servants of needs, and that can become corrupted. Oh, sorry. Yes.
So, Peter, I wanted to ask you, you talk about pain and suffering. If we, and Matthew seems to jump from that to therefore we shouldn't, if the cockroaches feel pain, we shouldn't kill them. But it seems that if you're concerned about the pain, and I think you've actually written about this, I mean, if we could provide them with an anesthetic, for example, before we do anything to them, if we could figure out that this, in fact, diminished their pain, if we had enough evidence of finding out that they suffered pain, presumably we could figure out when they don't suffer pain, would there be anything wrong with killing them if we just anesthetize them when we do it and they have no pain? But then the further question is, would there be something wrong with eliminating their consciousness? In other words, is there something about these animals such that the fact that they do, let's suppose, have consciousness of pain makes it the case that we can't avoid all these problems by just sort of, if we could, painlessly eliminate their capacity for consciousness? It seems like there has to be something else about a creature in order for its retention of consciousness to be of significance. And if we can get rid of its pain by anesthesia, if we can get rid of its consciousness without further bothering it, there must be some other reason. I'm just saying that because you focus on pain, this seems to be a problem. I can see a way to answer it, but I just want to know what you have to say about this.
Yeah, I don't see why there actually has to be something else. I mean, I specifically, when Matthew mentioned that, I specifically said if our method of killing cockroaches causes them pain. I didn't say that it's wrong to kill a cockroach painlessly. Now, you could have a discussion about that. You could say, well, the cockroach is enjoying its life, if we could somehow know that, and therefore you're cutting off its enjoyment. And of course, that leads to famous arguments in terms of domestic animals about, well, yeah, but they wouldn't even exist if we didn't kill them. So you get into that kind of discussion.
But that's why I was concerned that you didn't ever mention things like if we get rid of them or if we get rid of their consciousness and so avoid all of this problem about pain, they won't have as many pleasant or good experiences, okay? I have questions whether that would be sufficient grounds for not eliminating their consciousness, but it seems like someone like you who focuses on pain or sensation and sentience has to place much more emphasis on pleasurable capacities, because it's quite easy to get rid of the pain if we really tried. Just eliminate their consciousness.
Well, it's theoretically easy to do it. It's not actually easy to raise chickens.
But it's not, there isn't a moral problem.
No, I don't think there would be a moral problem. I think if you could eliminate the consciousness of chickens, then eating them and raising them would be like eating and raising cabbages, except maybe there would be more negative environmental aspects to it. Maybe it would be more wasteful of grain and so on. But I don't think that's an ethical issue in itself.
Okay, I think many people might find it problematic that it's so easy to eliminate this thing that people are so concerned about, respecting in some sense by not harming it. And I'm just saying that it might be easier to reject the elimination if you focused on pleasure, although I don't think that is a sufficient argument. But anyway, thank you very much.
Dave?
I just wanted to say, I think it's an interesting point because it's an area where we have a completely different attitude towards other humans and other species. That we think we kind of have a moral duty to put down an animal that's in pain. The idea of putting down a human being is abhorrent. And I find it most extraordinary that we have this absolute reversal of our ethical view between humans and non-humans.
But see, I think that there are some people who will reject the idea that the consciousness and the sensation of pain is what's really driving their arguments, because they think that there's something wrong with eliminating the pain in this way. I disagree, but I think that this is a further line of argument.
So this is an ethical question. So I'm an animal researcher, right? But I research the human animal. And we do things like record from neurons in awake humans when they're in surgery. And we don't feel anything I don't at least, ethically wrong with that because we get consent, because humans can give us consent. Now, I don't do other animal research because I personally, think that they have some feeling and they can't give consent. However, I'm not fundamentally against the idea of other people doing animal research, because as Peter was saying, this idea of greater good. So I was curious as all of your opinions on this. I'm doing research in humans to try to help cure and psychiatric and neurological illness. There are certain types of research that we can't yet do in humans, so we have to do in animal models, that they might feel pain. They're not going to be comfortable for these animals. When we implant electrodes and record from live animals, it's not a pleasant thing. So the question is the greater good? Is this, it's an ethical dilemma that I haven't quite resolved in my own mind about animal research and the greater good for human disease. So it might be causing them some pain, but overall the suffering might be relieved on a grander scale. So I just wanted to get your take on that.
Well, Peter and I disagree a little bit on this. I think that there are lots of really deep, I appreciate the fact that you've decided that the kind of relationships you want to be in are relationships that are, that you want to hold up to yourself, talk to your children, your grandchildren, that no, I wasn't going to be involved in that. But you don't want to judge others. That seems like a reasonable place to be. I don't think this question about potential greater good actually can justify a whole level of harms. And I think that as we've seen, potential greater good is often never realized. And so I think that that's one of the real problems of doing that. I don't want to make it seem as I said, I don't think there's anybody, I don't want to vilify the people who are engaged in this. I do think that there is a very real and genuine concern about promoting greater good, but I just know too many instances when it's just not realized. And so I often wonder, so let's say we're gonna go with the utilitarians. We'll eliminate all the animals, and that will actually minimize suffering, right? I still think we're going to be able to figure out how to minimize human suffering. I think we'll just have to reconfigure. We have an infrastructure in place that's already set up so that it's. And I know this. I work with people who do animal research. The infrastructure's already there. It's just too hard to shift the infrastructure. If the it's sort of like, think about it in terms of petroleum. If the infrastructure wasn't there, I have every confidence in you and your colleagues that you'll figure out a way to end human suffering.
Do you want to comment? No. Well, I might agree with you a lot of your point about that we can find better ways, alternative ways of ending human suffering. But you brought up the point about invasive research on animals that is directed towards finding out whether they can suffer. So I think Victoria Braithwaite's research is an example of that, right? So you have to, I take it, to do this research, you have to use these somewhat noxious stimuli, the acetic acid, to show the pain response, if that's what it is, in fish. And that hopefully will convince people, I guess that fish feel pain. And perhaps that will lead to some people saying, I'm not going to eat fish anymore, and therefore will save the lives of an unknown numbers of fish that would have otherwise suffered. And possibly it will also lead to more humane treatment of handling of fish. I believe that the Norwegians, for example, are researching humane stunning of fish. And if somebody didn't believe that fish can feel pain, they wouldn't do that. So, as a utilitarian, I think that if Victoria is very careful to use the minimal amount of pain or distress in order to get valid research results, and if that has the potential to save, not just millions, I guess, because the estimates of the number of fish we kill each year is around 1 trillion, I think, vast numbers from suffering, I'd be prepared to accept that.
But we just heard that Stuart said that he doesn't believe fish feel pain, and Colin said we need to now experiment on vast numbers of more fish in order to determine whether they.
I don't think he said vast. He said many
said
more species.
How many species were there? There were a lot of species, right? So that it's not. It's nice to think of it in the abstract. I agree with you in the abstract. If it were to be the case, but it's not clear to me that hypothetical is actually going to come to pass. So there needs to be some discussion about that.
Yeah, it certainly should be
Yeah.
discussed. Yeah.
So Anya, and then Stuart, and then Stephen, and Stuart, and Dale. And then
So now I have two mics. I can ask two questions. No, so this is a question for Professor Dawkins. I'm wondering what, on your view, the reason is supposed to be why we care. I'm here. Or, sorry. What the reason is why we're supposed to care about animal welfare. Because I get the idea about animal welfare without consciousness. This has lots of advantages if you look at it from the scientific side. But the reason why a lot of people brought the consciousness in, I think, was that this was the main argument for why we should care. I mean, as Peter Singer was explaining, that consciousness seems to be this kind of moral marker that we now owe the being consideration. And in your case, I wasn't quite clear what the reason was. It sounded a little bit, it was a purely instrumental reason that we should care, and I don't even know if it was moral in any way. So it seemed to have to do with the benefits we could reap from healthier animals or something like that. And you might think, okay, yeah, I mean, to me, that just sounds like the wrong sort of motivation to care. But I just mainly wanted clarification what, on your view, the reason for the caring would be.
I know a lot of people find the idea that you should be nice to animals because it's good for humans repellent. I'm not suggesting that you use that as a substitute. I'm saying there are a lot of people who don't buy the animal consciousness reasons for animal welfare, but would be convinced by saying, well, you're going to have better, healthier food. You're not going to have lower levels of disease. It's the same argument that conservationists use when, instead of saying, isn't this tree beautiful, they say rainforests are important for preserving various bits of the planet and the water and so on. So I'm not suggesting that as a substitute. It's just an addition. It's going to bring on board a whole range of people who are not as yet convinced that consciousness in animals is sufficiently strong that they would change their view. I mean, I was actually quite interested. As we went out to lunch, there was somebody distributing leaflets, and she said a vegan diet is much healthier. She was using that argument, not the ethical argument to animals. I'm simply saying it's an additional argument. It's not a substitute.
Can I just say one little thing? I mean, I get the point about the additional argument. I use that argument myself, but they might come apart. I mean, it might turn out at some point that, what's good for us, in fact, isn't so good for the animals anymore. You might develop super drugs that, make them really big without making them sick at the same time. That will be great for us. We could feed a lot of people, say that the meat is even tastier. And then that reason would totally go out of the window. But
yes, I agree with that. But there's a lot of what's called low-hanging fruit. If you actually look at the welfare problems around the world, they're things like tail biting in pigs, lameness in dairy cows. They're basic health problems, and there's a lot we could do just by improving animal health that would improve animal welfare. So I completely agree with you. It could end up that it wasn't good for animals, but I think there's an awful lot we could do that would benefit both us and animals.
I have 1 point for Marian and 1 point for Peter. I don't know if it'll change the substance of your talk, Marian, but you're not talking about the hard problem. You're talking about the other minds problem. They're not the same. The hard problem is how and why do organisms feel rather than just behave, a la Dennett. That's the hard problem. The other minds problem is which organisms feel and what do they feel. And I think that's the one you're talking about, are not having to solve a priori before we can still improve things for animals. Am I wrong?
Oh, well, I thought I was talking about the first one, actually.
No, it's not. We don't have to solve the hard problem in order to justify animal, in order to stop eating animals completely. We don't have to say how and why consciousness arose in evolution, and none of that has to be solved for that, nor its causal role, nor anything.
I suppose I meant that in your decision about which animals you would or wouldn't.
That's the other mind's problem.
That would be the other mind's problem. That if you're saying, would I or would I not eat this animal? How will I treat this animal? Knowledge of whether or not it feels anything is the crucial
It's
thing.
the other mind's problem.
Okay.
Okay, so
I thought your line was that it was precisely because we don't have a solution to the hard problem
Yes.
that the other mind's problem
Exactly.
is so difficult.
Thank you, David. Yes.
Two philosophers, two opinions.
Thank you.
anyway, for Peter, this is about cockroaches and chickens. You said a chicken calculation of the usual utilitarian sort. The question from you was somewhat different. It was, what right do I have to eradicate cockroaches from my house if they feel? And I would suggest that before we go to sci-fi, which is, can we design an animal that doesn't feel? That's all. And before we even go to utilitarian calculations of the kind that Laurie is less impressed by, we can use the criterion of vital necessity. I mean, there's a conflict of interest between me and thousands of cockroaches or bed bugs that justifies my doing something that is not there for the elephant in the room, which is eating animals, taking their fur, using them in rodeos, and all the other horrors that we do with them.
Well, I certainly, I agree, and I think I said in my talk that, where we are uncertain about animals, we ought to give them the benefit of the doubt, and, we don't need to eat fish. As I said, we have other nutrients, for example, because I was talking about fish where there's uncertainty, and obviously with animals where there isn't that uncertainty even, then clearly I totally agree with you. That is the huge issue. But I'm not sure, I don't know that the defense of necessity really helps with cockroaches. It's not that cockroaches are going to poison you or anything like that. They're a bit unpleasant to have running around. People think that they're unhygienic. I'm not sure that the evidence for that is very good. You probably could live, with cockroaches. Bed bugs might be a slightly different issue. But I don't think you really need to poison cockroaches.
Hi, Miriam, I really appreciated your point about language being used loosely and experiential terms being introduced, and when the experience at least ought to be discussed and certainly not assumed. I just wonder if you think you've made the same mistake when you talk about what animals want. And then, Peter, there's a long history of human beings getting together to fight and struggle and to escape bondage, to get equal rights, to, broadly speaking, reduce their suffering. I think it's fair to say that animals don't share that history. So when it comes to animal welfare, it's really always on our terms because we don't know what the animal terms actually are. And I wonder if you think that's problematic at all.
I think you're probably right. I have committed my own sin. But I think that I would also say that I can define it in two ways and be clear in any one instance which one I am using. I mean, some people use the word emotion in several different ways and are clear which they mean. Perhaps it would be better to be clearer, but I think I'm prepared to be a little bit ambiguous.
You're right that there's a long history of human beings expanding their concerns and helping to liberate themselves and others. And I think we've got to the stage in that point of history, just in the previous century, where we accepted that all human beings were included within the sphere of morality and all human beings were regarded as having universal rights. But I don't see why we should stop at that point. I don't see that the history of that human struggle means that we, having got to the point where we include all members of our species, at least in theory, I'm not suggesting that we actually do in practice, but we recognize that in terms of our language and our statements of rights, I don't see why we should not then recognize, well, look, the boundary of species really is also not a morally crucial boundary because, as I was arguing, the fact that a being suffers or feels pain is just as bad whether it's a chimpanzee or a dog or a chicken or a fish, if we can have some confidence that it does. That pain is just as bad, making allowances for the fact that it's a different kind of pain, but where we could have rough comparisons, as if it were a human. So I don't see anything in the history of human struggles and the fact that, of course, I agree, non-human animals can't struggle in that organized way, because they don't have those sorts of concepts, I don't see why that precludes us from broadening that so that we include all beings capable of suffering.
Right. So, so I'm on Anya's point again, from a slightly different perspective, and this is the question directed to Marian, but I'd be very happy for Laurie or Peter to also chime in on this. So I'm struck by the fact that you work on animals usually that are deeply enmeshed in our agricultural systems, and it's always it's sort of a good principle of tactics to only fight about the things that matter, and if you can avoid hard and difficult fights about the meaning of life, whether God exists, or the hard problem of consciousness, and actually make somebody's life better, it's probably a good thing to do that. And so in that domain, I can understand why avoiding questions about consciousness and so on can actually be quite useful tactically in trying to improve animal welfare standards for chickens and changing the architecture of slaughterhouses and so on. But if we sort of draw back and look at this more globally, and now what I'm going to give you is a combination of anecdote and speculation. I think the history of the last 50 years and going 50 years forward is going to be written as the rise in concert of views about animal consciousness, animals having very sophisticated minds, being able to do really incredible things. Think of it as Jane Goodall writ large, combined with also a radical change in outlook about how we should morally relate to animals. And so my worry is that I feel that you might be making a tactical point that has some validity in a very particular welfare context, but that you oughtn't to sort of overgeneralize that insofar as you're making a tactical argument for whether people should talk about consciousness and related mental states.
I think, once again, I just reiterate, I am not saying that animals are not conscious. I don't think we should give up on that issue. I just didn't want to be in a position of saying, well, we can't make progress in animal welfare science until we've solved it. So I think, I hope I didn't give the impression that I thought we should stop talking about consciousness.
Okay, but just to sharpen the question, there are people who do animal welfare science who are happy to talk about animals having conscious states and so on.
Yes.
And I'm not sure whether your position is that there's something wrong or defective about that they oughtn't be doing it at all, or just that you think there's another path that's a perfectly good path to solve other kinds of problems.
Yes, and I outlined the different viewpoints. I happen to have more sympathy with one of the standpoints than the others. But I know a lot of my colleagues feel very differently. And I also think that if you focus on the things you can measure, you may actually make more progress than muddling yourself with in other ways.
Hi, so two different kind of ideas came up earlier. And we were talking about eliminating pain from animals and or eliminating consciousness. I assume that by that we're talking about eliminating pain, whether it be the peripheral nervous system or the part in the brain that is associated with pain. And we also talked about cutting a happy life short, cutting a lifespan short if they were going to have a good life. And as we know with humans that actually suffer from diseases that stop them from feeling pain, they actually do end up dying at typically very young ages, and because they're not able to receive the message of pain, they can't respond to it. They don't know how to, they can no longer function with an injury, and they end up dying very soon. So would removing pain from animals to allow different problems in ethical research, would that actually be ethically wrong for other reasons of maybe shortening their lives when they're not completely contained in the lab and we're taking care of them?
Well, I don't know. It was a hypothesis that Frances put up, I think, to challenge my views. And I assumed that she was talking about eliminating consciousness altogether rather than just eliminating pain. And if we're eliminating consciousness altogether, then I think for the reasons that I argued, they're not conscious beings, they're not experiencing anything positive either, and I'm not troubled if the fact that their lives are then shorter. But you know, it's a hypothesis. It's not something that we're actually going to work on.
So I'm the person who is handing out the leaflets. And
There you go.
thank you. You probably were passing by pretty quickly because I kind of listed vegans have better sex, better health, cleaner conscience, longer lifespan, and the lightest footprint on our at-risk planet. So thank you to all the people here who are vegan and are taking steps to get there pretty quickly. I am listening to all this and really just wondering about the human species. Just even these questions and our language is so speciesist, and I understand why. We've all grown up with it. I grew up eating meat, dairy, and eggs without another thought in my mind of the violence, the suffering, the unbelievable torture, really, that these captive beings undergo. I had no idea that it was the #1 cause of cancer, heart disease, obesity, diabetes, impotence, osteoporosis, kidney and liver disease. I had no idea that it is destroying our planet faster than all the other industries. Yes, combined. So my question to you is, can we sort of open up the sphere of our minds to wonder about the human species, how we got to be so cold in our hearts, to not consider that we are not gods, we have no right to steal the lives, to experiment on. These animals are not, our sister brother animals are not here for experimentation, food, clothing, etc. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, if the question was how we got to this stage, unfortunately we have all descended from beings who had to be rather selfish in order to survive and reproduce, and we still have a fair bit of that in us. That's not the only thing in us. Fortunately, we have other capacities as well, empathy, reason, and so on. But I think it's a constant struggle, unfortunately, to get people to be concerned about the suffering we're inflicting on animals.
Yeah.
Oops, that's mine.
So I as Tanya Singer and Paul Bloom and Jean Dessity have all been kind of showing us, emotional empathy is, we're going through a very steep downgrade of emotional empathy and looking at animals and saying, oh, aren't they cute and I love you, and look at how they help their young and all that gushy stuff is not particularly helpful with humans. What I reflecting on here is that we've okay, so we've parked that, but now we move to theory of mind, and so we're going like, put myself in their shoes or think about how they can be like me, and so we're kind of running this sort of broad kind of sloppy quasi theory of mind and saying, well, yeah, because they're like me in that they have consciousness and all that, well then they have a higher status and I'm going to be concerned about them. And that's fine to a point, but we also know that that's flawed in terms of how we relate to other humans, and perhaps it's also has its flaws in how we relate to animals, and we could sort of start looking more broadly at a more broad concern for them, kind of loosely analogous to the sort of tripartite model of empathy towards this sort of compassion that's other-directed, and other-directed in the sense of what Whiteheadian, process people might call enjoyment or self-realization, or this kind of more buzzy word, flourishing. And how can we negotiate? And you can take that as the question: is how can we negotiate our interests with theirs rather than trying to sort of confine it in terms of suffering?
I have a little book on that topic. You could read. I do think that there's a real shift in thinking ethically from thinking about our relationships and identifying the ways in which we're engaging and relating to others. And that could be other humans or that could be other animals. And the more individualistic framework where what we're doing is trying to identify particular kinds of capacities or traits or suites of capacities and traits and determine what our ethical duties, obligations are in light of those. And so I think that one of the things that has been missing from a certain kind of literature about ethics and animals is the idea that there's more to what's happening in the sort of larger moral picture than just identifying that this particular creature has a wanton desire and I have a certain set of wants and desires and we're going to put them up against each other. I think that there's a lot more room for thinking more broadly about the kind of relationships that we are in necessarily, the kinds of relationships that we want to be in, the ways that we can avoid certain kinds of dangers, problematic relationships that might arise. And I think that that's one of the things that is the reason I wanted to raise these questions about how animals are being treated in order to determine whether or not they're conscious is not to say, sort of, as again, to reiterate, that there's some sort of problematic moral monsters engaging in this kind of practice, but that we tend to occlude that altogether. We talk in very abstract terms, and it's very, it's important, I think, to be part of an ethical discussion about what has been happening, what is happening, what the implications of certain kinds of questions might be for the relationships that we have with other animals.
I didn't mean to confuse it with negotiation. I was trying to push self-realization.
I'm interested in the relation between the expansion of the expanding circle that Peter described and moral standards of right and wrong. If you're a utilitarian, the relation is very simple, because the more one recognizes suffering and pleasure in a wider range of creatures, the more material there is to feed into the kind of cost-benefit calculation that determines right and wrong if you're a utilitarian. But, of course, not everyone is a utilitarian. And in a way, I want to ask a double-barreled question. One part of it is, if you're not a utilitarian, how can we expect morality to develop to accommodate the greatly expanded population of the world of beings that merit consideration? And maybe Laurie has some views about that. But the second part of my question is for Peter, because although, I mean, as you have said in many places, although you regard utilitarianism as the truth about what is right and wrong, what we should do, it's necessary, it's necessary to accommodate certain facts about human nature and, the history of the development of human institutions, so that, in fact, it doesn't make sense to require everyone to give away their resources until they're at the diminishing, the level of marginal utility equivalent to the poorest person on the planet and so on. So this kind of give, in your view, of the real consequences for actual morality of utilitarianism leads, not to the adoption of something equivalent to a typical non-utilitarian view, but there's a bit of convergence on these grounds. And I wondered, whether you think in this case as well, there are serious constraints on what can be expected in the way of the inclusion of the entire animal kingdom in the foundation of our morality, based on the fact, that the mosquito is my natural enemy.
Right. Laurie, did you want to deal with the first part of the question?
I think it's precisely what I was hoping to raise precisely what I was hoping to raise, thank you for that, Tom, is that there are a variety of ways that we can come to understand these moral relationships that we're in, and thinking of them in terms of care, compassion, respect. Those are the kinds of things that are part of a moral sort of world that go beyond suffering. So I think suffering is a very important consideration, obviously, but I don't think it's the only consideration. And I just wanted to sort of dovetail on your second point to raise this with Peter, and that's about the expected utility function. So if you're optimistic and this is why I've moved from that, if you're optimistic about the expected utility, there's going to be a very different kind of moral determination than if you're not optimistic about that. And how you become optimistic or not is an important part of a moral psychological question. So that dovetails, I think, with Tom's, if you want to say something about that.
Yeah. Well, I certainly think it's a good question as to how we fit these views that are, as with the Sidgwick that I quoted, based on a sort of a standard that people are not really living to, that is, that every individual's well-being is important as my own, and so on. And how do we then try to implement that or advocate for it in the world in which we're living? So, as you probably know, you mentioned the case of what we ought to be doing for the global poor, and in practice there, in a lot of my writings aimed at the general public, I've advocated a much lower standard than the one you mentioned, which is, that you should give to the point of diminishing marginal utility. Rather, I've suggested, as other people have, that people should give 10% of their income or some graduated figure that's much less. So I would see your question is, well, what is the equivalent of that in this question of how we ought to respond to the interests of animals, and especially if, as we've heard today, we think that there's a real possibility, even perhaps a probability, that consciousness goes beyond the vertebrates to invertebrates, as you say, the mosquitoes and so on. So here I would think that the practical thing to do in terms of our public advocacy still is not to start a campaign for insect rights. I think that's not going to be a winner in the foreseeable future, certainly not in my lifetime or yours, Tom. Maybe, if we're very lucky, in the lifetime of some of the younger people in the room. But I think, given how badly we're treating vertebrates, as Stephen said, in particular, the big question of the billions of animals who are suffering in factory farms, so that because we enjoy the taste of their flesh, those are the kinds of things that we ought to be working on, I think. And perhaps at some future point, we'll have dealt with those problems. Perhaps we'll all be vegan, as the person was suggesting, and I mean that might be helped, incidentally, not just by moral argument, but by the development of plant-based or in vitro meat that doesn't involve suffering, which could overcome that problem. And then maybe it'll be time to start thinking about invertebrates and how we ought to respond to them. So I think that's the way I would make the kind of utilitarian compromise with what ideally we might do and with what we can reasonably expect people as they are in the world to respond to.
Hi. This question's for Professor Dawkins. I'm afraid it's a bit of a follow-up on Anya's question, but it should be a pretty quick one, I think. So, if we were to adopt the animal welfare standard that you suggest with wants and needs defined behaviorally so as not to sneak in an assumption of consciousness, as somebody mentioned, are you at all worried that some of the target audience of this shift, people who are skeptical about the ethical importance of animals, will suggest that there could be some sort of will suggest that plant welfare is, because it could similarly be defined in terms of wants and needs if there's no assumption of consciousness, would have an equal claim to being cared about from an ethical perspective, which some people would consider a reductio. Is that a concern, or is that like nobody would talk about plant welfare? Maybe it's a sociological question, but thank you.
I don't think it's a simple question. Certainly, plants have needs. If you don't water them, they die. In the same way, if you don't give animals water, they die. I think animal wanting is actually structurally very different from plant wanting. I mean, plants do it by growth, possibly. Animals have developed nervous systems for getting what they want in incredibly complicated ways. So I think I'd make a distinction on that basis.
Oh, but that's getting pretty close to talking about consciousness, isn't it? I mean, why is it relevant to have a more complicated nervous system, or as somebody said, a more unified nervous system? Why should we give more attention to that if it's not that we suspect that in some way that's pointing to consciousness?
I'm just more concerned with complicated mechanisms, leaving aside the question of consciousness.
Okay.
Why are complicated mechanisms something we should care about?
Well, I think that I probably would have to say that it was to do with nervous systems and nervous ability to not just respond in a very predetermined way, but to have flexibility. To me, flexibility, I leave open the question of how much flexibility you need to have consciousness. To me, flexibility gives you a different kind of wanting. Exactly which kind of wanting has consciousness, I leave open.
I'm glad we mentioned communication earlier in this session, and we want probably to ask at some point those entities, are animals or even AIs. I know that there is some research that's closer to my field of how we can ask any entity about their wants and needs. Now my question is about these wants and needs are something very different, and on the one hand you have something that is more like attractors, gradients, how you drive a system, and the system is going to reply to you, I want to go this way. And on the other hand you have things like viability, how an individual or even groups of individuals or the whole biosphere wants to be viable as a whole. And is there a conflict, and how do we, I know it's a difficult question, but how do we deal with this?
Do you mean is there a conflict between we may want things that we don't need, or
good for
not
us.
not good for us? I think my answer to that would be that needs and wants evolved in a natural world in which the wants evolved to serve the needs. So, for example, if you had a bird in a cage and in the autumn it wanted to migrate, you can't tell it, you'll be safer if you stay here, we'll feed you, we'll protect you. The want will be there. The want takes on as it were, a life of its own. I think that's the really interesting thing about animals. And you get this separation when you put animals or people in unnatural situations, like an environment in which there's lots of sweet, salty food. We want it. We don't. It's not good for our health.
This is mostly for Peter Singer, and also I think it relates to the first question in this question session. On the utilitarian principle, we are talking about the good. but we have tended to define it today in terms of suffering and pleasure, and pain and pleasure, suffering and happiness. And that, to me, seems to be a rather simplistic. We may be underselling both ourselves and animals. For example, on the pain problem, a rat mother will traverse tremendous strengths of electric shock to retrieve her pups that have been separated from her. And so she seems to value the good in terms of her reproductive success more than her physical pain. And we ourselves, of course, would never define our good in terms of simple things like pleasure and pain, or and when we come to the farm animals, maybe they would say, I'll be glad for you to eat me as long as you keep my calves safe and let them grow up to be eaten, because that promotes my reproductive success, and so on. So the good is a complicated question, and I wonder how you would respond to that.
I do have a more simplistic account than you do. And I don't think it's right to talk about either the rat or other animals wanting their reproductive success. I don't think they have that concept. The mother rat, no doubt, has a strong attraction. You can say love for her offspring, and no doubt is distressed to be separated from them, and therefore will put up with electric shock in order to be reunited with them and do the protective things she does. But she's not thinking of reproductive success. And similarly, the animals that we're raising for food are not going to enter into contracts with us, although various people have talked about that. They're not capable of making those kinds of bargains. And I think that really their goods do come down to them having lives that have the largest possible surplus of enjoyment or happiness, whatever it is they're capable of, pleasure, over balance of pain or displeasure or misery, whatever you want to call it. Now, in terms of us humans, yes, we do have a lot of independent goals, and of course there's a lively debate among philosophers as to whether those are all separate intrinsic goods, as pluralists would argue, or whether, as Sidgwick, who I quoted, argued that in fact the others are instrumentally good and are not intrinsically good unless in some way they do lead to more desirable consciousness for all affected, and of course in the long run, not necessarily the short term. And I think that that's a plausible view.
I didn't say that they were conscious of their reproductive success, simply that it was reproductive success that drove their choices ultimately.
No, it's not. It's not. I mean, you could say they have those drives because if they didn't, then they wouldn't have. Their offspring would not have survived, and that's why they've inherited those drives.
Exactly.
Right.
That's all I was
claiming. But that, to say that means that that's a good thing in itself would be to imply that evolution has some purpose or creates only things in it that are good, and I don't think, I think that's a fallacy.
Thanks. This is a question for Marian. I'm thinking, so I'm appreciating your thought that, look, we haven't solved a certain, I'm over here. In the front row, corner, that we haven't, I saw that you're looking around, that we haven't solved a range of problems, and so it's good to think about how we should proceed to make decisions about how to treat animals, given that we haven't solved some of these problems, which are very hard. What is consciousness? Which creatures have it, etc. It seems to me, though, that obviously the question of whether these animals are genuinely suffering in the way people are talking about is still very important. And I'm wondering what you think about a different way of proceeding, which is a way that we often proceed when we haven't yet solved a certain problem, right? If I know that it's going to rain later and I don't want to get wet, I take my umbrella. If I know that it's not and I don't want to carry stuff around, I don't take my umbrella. If I don't know whether it's going to rain, though, I don't just say, oh, I have no idea what to do, right? We have strategies for figuring out what to do when there's uncertainty. And it seems to me that this is a really important one, and the way we act has really potentially very, very bad consequences. And it also seems to me that we have a lot of evidence in various directions, perhaps, but that we should be thinking about, and maybe this is picking up on something that Peter Singer was saying anyway, talking about the benefit of the doubt. Just given the information we have, how we should be acting. Even if we haven't solved it in the sense in which maybe you'd like it to be solved, we definitely have information relevant to it, and maybe there are opinions that we should have about it at this point, even if we don't want to consider these problems solved.
I think I was making a very pragmatic point that you're faced with somebody who doesn't accept the evidence, doesn't think animals are particularly important. Should you spend your energy trying to convince them that those animals are conscious and that's why they should, or should you say, actually, if you treat them this way, there will be other benefits? It's literally, I mean, it's a pragmatic argument rather than a philosophical one.
So entirely, there's no, you're not thinking like these are reasons we should all be considering. This is like, what's my strategy for convincing someone not to do something?
Yes, and particularly if you're considering people in perhaps countries with lower incomes that are much more worried about their food. And do you actually want to start having an argument about animal consciousness, or do you actually want to find something that everybody has in common? Everybody wants healthy food, and nobody wants to have bird flu or whatever. And it's just simply, well, how do you convince the unconvinced best?
Sounds like a good utilitarian strategy.
So this is quite related, actually. A central theme running throughout much of the discussion has been that despite the fact that we're uncertain whether animals can suffer, we still have significant reason to try to institute certain reforms that will reduce their suffering if they can suffer. Now, I'm quite friendly to this idea. I think the risk that they suffer is high enough and the numbers are large enough that we should be trying to reduce factory farming and so on and so forth. I'm wondering what any of you guys think would change if we, say, boosted our credence that, say, fish feel pain or can suffer up to like 0.99. Like, would you just prioritize things differently, or given constraints on people's willingness to be convinced that certain vertebrates feel pain before they're willing to be convinced that other things feel pain, we're just going to keep instituting the same reforms in the same order that we were going to already? So would resolving the uncertainty about whether animals suffer really change anything about how you go about advocating for animals? Anyone?
Well, I'll have a go. I do think that in the case of fish, it's relevant to say how likely it is that they can suffer. I didn't say very much about fish for most of my career. I don't think I wrote very much about it in Animal Liberation, and I haven't, during the years when I was actively campaigning for animals, which was back when I was in Australia in the 80s and 90s, the organisations that I was leading didn't make fish a priority. Since then, I guess two things have happened. One is I've had a greater sense of the number of fish that we're harming, partly through a website called Fish Count. And that number is, the number of chickens is vast, it's like 60 billion or something a year. But then when you think about maybe 1 trillion, maybe even more fish, then I did start to talk to people here, because I was then in the United States, about campaigning about fish. And I'm pleased to see that some organisations are now starting to think about campaigning about fish. But for that to make sense, it's important that you do think that there's a reasonably high probability that fish can feel pain. And so the higher you can get that, I think the greater that priority becomes to run that campaign.
Thank you for this excellent day and this terrific panel. So I'm a pescatarian, which in this room would only be worse if I were a Republican, I think. But I told my friends when I was coming here that this might be my last non-vegan day. And I'm loath to disappoint that warm round of applause to tell you that this afternoon's panel has me more confused than ever. my only motivation is in suffering, and what I come from Pennsylvania, and I have many friends who are eloquent and ethical hunters, and so it's really interesting to me what goals we're directed towards. So where I come from, there are no vegan restaurants. You cannot eat breakfast in a restaurant without involving animals, anywhere within a 100-mile radius. So, and furthermore, I'll take this one step further. For the overwhelming number of species on this planet who aren't sitting in animal consciousness conferences, my concern is that as we drive toward the science of understanding this, that we're creating a magisteria in which how we construct our experiments are singularly pointed toward our desire. I mean, I want fish to be able to sense pain so that I can be driven toward a more ethical life, right? And if I'm honest with myself, I argue toward that. And so the objective observer in me listens to my hunter friends who say, an elk has twice the protein of a cow. And the rest of the world that thinks that the natural environment of a cow is on top of styrofoam and underneath cellophane, I know that I can eat 2 ounces of elk and get 4 ounces of cow's worth of protein, and it's much leaner and healthier and so forth. And when I've taken that elk, I've given it the most humane death available to it in any circumstance. So you see how it's an interesting failing to presume this, and I wonder, as we construct, could you please comment on the construction of experiments that presupposes the need or is influenced by, our biased anthropomorphization of the subjects? Thank you.
I just want to offer a tangential comment. I think it's a tangential comment. And I think one of the things that's really important in thinking about the ethical questions here is the framework that we're operating under. And so much of the discussions today have focused on questions about sort of in the abstract, questions about whether or not so-and-so is conscious, whether or not this consciousness leads to suffering, and then the ethical implications are that, suffering has an ethical valence, that we're concerned about suffering. But I just want to turn the frame slightly and think about it instead in the way that, for example, Cora Diamond does. And this, you're talking about your hunter friend reminded me of this. So Cora Diamond suggests that this whole talk of suffering and not suffering sort of misses an important feature of our moral relationships. We have respect for each other and have certain norms that we've developed that manifest that respect. And so part of the reason that we don't eat our dead and that we don't eat our amputated limbs, this is her, is because it puts us in a very peculiar relationship to each other and ourselves. And so I think that there's a sense in which that would be a way of questioning how we engage with other animals, rather than thinking, and this is part of what I was trying to get at about thinking about our relationships. Suffering matters. It absolutely matters, and I don't want to deny that it's mattering. But I think that there's certain methodology that already puts it so that what we're doing is engaging in a kind of process of measurement, rather than recognizing that maybe there's a different way of categorizing or thinking about the categories, and that we can express respect or care for other animals without necessarily having to calculate whether or not we get 4 grams of protein versus 2 grams of protein, or any sort of calculation of that sort.
I was just going to suggest that after the session's over, you get together with the lady who was handing out the vegan leaflets. And she'll tell you that you don't really need all that protein. You're a grown man anyway. Your protein needs are really quite low.
We have 3 minutes left, and we have 3 questions. So maybe we'll get the 3 questioners to ask their questions, and then we'll let you guys finish. So I got there, and here. So go ahead.
I'm pleased to follow the last questioner because I speak as someone who has been a vegan since 1976 and primarily became a vegan because of working in a chicken slaughterhouse, but there are other reasons as well. And within the last 40 years, we're seeing the world go to hell in a handbasket because of patriarchal capitalism. And one of my question is, why is this issue of, why is there I sense there's such a lack of urgency in the meeting today about the fate the planet and everyone who lives on the planet faces?
I just wanted to ask the panelists about wild animal suffering. How weighty do you think suffering in the wild might be compared with the total of human-inflicted suffering? And is there any way currently that knowledge of this could affect our decision-making, or is that just something speculative, maybe for the future?
Yeah, I just want to raise to say something about the fact that in humans there are all kinds of cultures, and one of them, for example, lots of people practice Buddhism, and they are not eating animals, and it is
not true.
Well, not all of them. Many of them don't, and
rather few.
Right, okay, but anyway, they eat far less than we do, than most other cultures do. And the question is, and this is based on a certain way of thinking and seeing and thinking about what animals are and what animals and how animals suffer. So I think that utilitarian kind of reasoning is not the only thing that we can take into consideration, but there is a whole kind of value kind of ethics that should be taken into consideration. Some kind of ideology that for us, for human beings, is enormously important and is driving our practices and our decisions.
Take one each.
Okay. I think I'm just constantly astonished, really, how illogical we are in our ways of responding to animals. That you might, rats, for example, the way people think of them as pests, whereas a dog they wouldn't, and the way we see different animals, which does not seem to be easily related to anything other than our own particular emotional responses to them.
There's too much to talk about. I think part of the question about urgency is actually that we end up often having a certain kind of leisure time to imagine different kinds of things. I think if the urgency was more vivid, as it is in most parts of the world, we wouldn't have the capacity to sit and discuss and debate ethical topics. So I think that part of it is both that we're lucky that we're not really faced immediately with the urgency, and part of that luckiness is our unluckiness, that in not being faced with it, we may be inadvertently leading to our own demise.
Right. Plus this is, after all, an academic conference, not really an animal advocates conference, and that might give you a different sense, I think. But I did want to say something about the wild animal suffering question, because I feel about that rather as I do about the campaign for insect rights. That is, I think it's a really important issue. I think, yes, there is a lot of suffering out there caused by wild animals. There are possibly some things we could do about it if we really wanted to, but if we were to do so, firstly, I don't think there is much public support for it. Secondly, to a large extent, the animal movement has worked together with the green or environmental movement. We're working for a better world in very similar ways. If we start talking about eliminating predators or reducing the suffering of species where they have kind of reproduction where most of their offspring starve to death within the first days of life, I think we're going to get into head-on conflict with environmentalists, different values. So again, it seems to me not an issue for the current decade at least.
Great. Let's thank the panelists for...
Okay, and we have a reception waiting for us with a special brief guest lecture from Professor Baba Brinkman, author of the treatise, The Rap Guide to Consciousness. That reception is waiting for us at 40 Washington Square South. Go out the front of the film center, turn left again, you'll find Washington Square. Go diagonally across Washington Square to the southwest corner, 40 Washington Square South. See you there, you're all invited.
Great. Really good day. Yes, yes.